linguistique, un historien de la génétique, tout à fait reconnu au niveau international et qui nous fait le plaisir de venir de UCLA où il est professeur pour nous apporter sa grande expertise sur l'histoire de l'hérédité des statistiques et qui va nous parler en anglais mais qui comprend bien le français. Thanks.
Oh, merci, thanks. I'm extremely interested in this conference and to see what will happen tomorrow as well as what has happened today. It is a reasonable but sometimes false assumption that the history comes before the events. In fact, the history is always being rewritten, partly in response to what people think is the current significance, and so I look forward to hearing more about how Fisher is being read and why this explosion of citations in the last 20 years. And for my presentation, I try to explain some of the circumstances involving statistics and evolutionary biology, and as well as a little bit of genetics, though that's not my main story, that to which Fisher is responding. So, but the usual, I think the usual story of Fisher's contribution is that at last in this 1918 paper, there is a kind of a reconciliation of Darwinian evolution with genetics, and especially an explanation of the factors that are continuous, that produce nice curves, and the factors that are discontinuous, that segregate, as Mendel calls it, like the 7 traits of his peas. Right. So I proceed with the with this kind of from that background. If so, by the way, I have actually quite not very elaborate slides, which are partly there for you if you have trouble with my English, but I hope not. But so the Fisher paper certainly was a response to a long debate about discontinuity, about whether the fundamental elements of genetics, of biology, whether it's should be producing distinct traits, or whether it should appear as continuous ones. And certainly the statistical mathematics of, to a degree, Francis Galton and Carl Pearson is emphasizing those continuous traits and is emphasizing traits that can be measured, even if Pearson also endorsed what he called Mendelian segregation as the most, he called it the most fundamental of Mendel's contributions. Darwin's theory, which I think is an important place to begin, was overwhelmingly about continuous variation. There's a famous objection, which made by a person called Fleming Jenkin, which is actually it's significant, I think, that Jenkins' argument has so often been turned around, and the argument Jenkins asked first whether the effect of selection in one generation, or the appearance of a new variation, could be perpetuated. That is, did Darwin give a mechanism that could lead not just to new forms which then disappear, but to continuous change that would explain, a massive long-term transformation of the kinds of the species and genera and families that we find on Earth. And one argument Jenkins gave was that that probably the change is confined within certain limits. That is, selection can produce some variation, but not infinite variation. And he gave the example of racehorses. They get so fast, but no faster, he says. And then he asks whether what they called a sport or a mutation, a significant change, Jenkins asked whether that could be the basis for biological change, and he says, well, it's very improbable that another one like it is going to appear. So he thought perhaps the kind of discontinuous variation would never work. Again, now Jenkins' argument is often cited, or has often been cited, as showing that evolution of small variations can never work, but actually for Darwin it reinforced what he already believed, that only small variations could produce evolutionary change, because small variation is being produced all the time. We don't often have kind of mutations available, he thought, but we always have little variations, and no reason why they can't continue generation after generation. Darwin's book is trying to teach us to recognize that what doesn't happen rapidly enough for us to see it in our own lifetimes can, over hundreds of millions and billions of years, produce immense changes. So again, actually, it's a little curious that the Jenkins argument is often seen as a argument against continuous variation going anywhere. But Jenkins actually was he didn't think continuous variation could go anywhere either. But his argument was about sports or mutations, which couldn't ever achieve anything. So. Anyhow, Darwin firmly, it's a very statistical argument in a way, though with no mathematics. That is to say, it depends on an accumulation of small changes, and a process of selection, which always shifts the balance a little bit towards the fittest variants, which again, he says, over many generations can have large-scale effects. Of course, we haven't heard actually very much about Darwin yet. We've heard quite a lot about Galton, so I will join those who have discussed Galton's ideas. Galton was thinking in terms of eugenics right from the start. I think that's already clear. He was inspired by Darwin's theory. Immediately he begins comparing Darwin's favorite examples, the results of agricultural breeding with what would be possible if similar processes of selection were applied to humans. In fact, Darwin makes so much of this, it is quite reasonable that Galton should attribute this to reading his cousin. In fact, it was, however, a commonplace long before Darwin ever talked about it either. That what could we achieve if we bred animals, humans, the way we bred animals? So Galton comes into this with ambitions. As he introduces the word eugenics, I think, in 1883. But he doesn't call it eugenics, but it is a kind of eugenics for which he offers other words at first. And then we've seen that he in his initial studies, he talked about actually with the peas. He talked about reversion toward the mean, and actually also we have actually these two different words that he used. First, reversion. And reversion is a word about going backward in time. So reversion was the reappearance of things, of ancestral traits, perhaps from many, many generations ago. And then after so he published his book on hereditary genius, was somewhat dissatisfied with its initial reception, and was thought that he needed to understand better the hereditary processes. So he took up the experimentation on peas, which you have seen, and got the graph that you have seen, which basically shows larger pea seeds producing larger offspring, but with this element of reduction, which he was calling reversion, and now actually he about very soon afterwards he introduced instead the word regression, and so the reversion is about a move to the past, and regression is rather about some kind of a move towards a stable form. So and the effects as you see them are in a way the same. That is, he uses these two words for the same processes, but there's a different idea implied in this stable form, which actually is now proposing at least the possibility that small variations cannot easily lead to important changes over a greater time. So let me just I get to this again in a second. But he oh yeah, I just wanted to say Galton is also establishing a real science of variability. So this again, we've seen that Fisher introduced the word variance to make the width of the distribution itself a thing that we can talk about. And in a way, Galton was doing that already, not with the same terms, but his peas, as you have seen, the average of the offspring was the average divergence of the offspring was less than that of the parents. And so that Galton, and he has this nice image to demonstrate that. But although and he confronted the question, in the early 1880s, that although the average of the offspring of any particular parent or parents was less than that of those parents, that the whole distribution of the pea seeds was the same. Actually, he demonstrated it, and he took that as what you would expect. So how is it that every family can have some reversion on average, and yet the whole population maintains the same degree of the same spread? Again, something quite a lot like what Fisher calls the variance. And this quincunx, if you've ever seen this, is kind of his answer to that. I don't actually have the right one here, but the seeds, if you have a lot of little tracks that bring all the seeds into a narrower frame, that is an example of the reversion for him. They all come back together, but then when you let them go again, they spread through the machinery to restore the curve to its original width. So the idea is that the process within a family is the narrowing produces an average spread, which is less, but there is also this other dimension, which is every family is spreading out, and you add what's left of the variation from this narrowing with the new variation that is added to every family when you with just this random spread, and you end up with a distribution which is much the same as before. So Galton gets the maintenance of the preservation of a distribution despite the perpetual process of reversion that he has demonstrated. Okay, well, oops, what did I? Yeah, so we okay. So then as I say, reversion is about the return to an ancestral mean. Regression is about for him same thing is going. I mean, that is, he sees the same phenomena, but now he interprets his this narrowing of the distribution for every given family as a return to a kind of a point of stability. So here I'll just Galton, who was a great producer of enlightening metaphors and images, gives us these rocks which sit in one place. You push it a little bit, and it goes back. But if you push it far enough, it actually turns over into another point of stability. So, but he gave nice examples from sociology, as he said, from a town. He says you can't combine a mining town or an industrial town with a beach resort because one or the other of these parties is going to leave. So, and similarly, you can't have certain traits don't work together in genetics. As long as you have one kind of a creature, it's not going to change into another kind, except with a very large push. So there is this this stability which is blocking the continued development. So this is actually a bit like that the Fleming-Jenkin argument I mentioned before, which is now that suggesting that there are obstacles to to continued variation in any direction. On the other hand, it is not quite the same as denying that that the processes of continuous variation can lead to, let us say, new species. It is so it's not that the small variations are ineffective, and that Galton doesn't have a different mechanism to produce the larger variations. If the selection is wide enough, and if there's enough opportunity for variation, it can, through the processes of selection and perhaps random effects, it can reach the point of switching over into the into a new point of stability. So it's a little bit true and a little bit false that that Galton was rejecting species change. I'm sorry, that Galton was rejecting species change through continuous selection and the continuous effects of whatever, he doesn't quite say random, but he means unexplained forces that produce that. And through that, actually those same mechanisms, in the end, I would say, reinforces Darwin's view that continuous selection can produce evolutionary change, even though Darwin never talked about the obstacle of these points of stability. Well, this point, however, is quite important because many, I think many biologists and many historians too have long argued that Galton, to a degree, and certainly Pearson, that the biometricians were insisting on continuous variation and that is, say, on what they called blending inheritance, in which the offspring should be something like the average of the parents, subject to a bit of variation. That they believed in blending inheritance, and that Mendelism insisted instead on discontinuous variation, that is on macro changes that were large enough to produce real change, that the blending inheritance could never produce such a change. So I actually was, I remember when I first heard a historian of biology say this, and I scratched my head because I'd never seen blending inheritance. And, through, searches and things, I found blended. Galton certainly talks about blended. That is, there are some things that blend, he says, and other things that are inherited discontinuously. He gave us, for discontinuous, there are, he instanced, mutants of various kinds or sports of nature. For the continuous ones, he emphasized, actually things like height. And then actually also, he made quite a lot of racial difference, which was provided a nice kind of model of blending inheritance. You pour the black fluid in with the white fluid and you get gray fluid. And, what are a red fluid? These colors are clearly colors of, exemplifying racial difference for him. He described as a phenomenon that, different kinds of variation, some which seem to blend, some things which seem to blend, some things which go together, but never a blended mechanism. In some ways, in some way, there's a bit of a false problem in supposing that, statistics was unable to imagine discrete differences. That is, real macro changes before Fisher appears on the scene, and part of that is because there never was a mechanism of blended inheritance that denied the possibility of discontinuous changes as well. And the other is actually that almost right from the start, that is, say, Ewell, whom again you have seen, and Pearson were interested in both of these, both the blended and the blending and the discrete kind, and they were both interested in how you could, from genetic mechanisms of a Mendelian kind, you could get the continuous variation as well as the kind that Mendel talked about, the alternative between very tall and very short peas, or rough and or round and oblong pea seeds, and so on. So that was a question that was on their minds all along. Here's another. You've seen this image has already appeared, and it is again often taken as a exemplification of this non-Mendelian pattern. I think actually Galton and the biometricians didn't really see that. It was just a kind of image to illustrate how much of the whatever hereditary material came from each parent and from each more remote ancestors, in which I think you all get that the as the image gets thinner as we move to the right, it's because much of the variation coming from these more remote ancestors is already present in the parent. So this is how much new variation coming from more remote ancestors, but not from the parents, is coming from each generation. So it's kind of a description. It could be, it could be, if you think that Mendelian and biometric mechanisms are different, this can be either one of these. It doesn't presume anything about that. It's also an image which appeared for a few years and does not at all dominate Galton's and Pearson's understandings of heredity, as it, I think, still often dominates the historical treatments of these things. But in any event, you know, the sharp distinction between blending and discontinuous, or blending and Mendelian variations, I think is quite false. I was going to say, but I shook my head a little bit, not very politely, perhaps, about Pearson refusing, refusing entities like genes at all. That's not totally false. He was a little bit, relativist about that. Is he always insisted that the scientific objects he was talking about, like he even says a circle, not allowing it to exist sort of independently, but always being our perception of always the human perceiver was present in the story as well. So maybe that always adds a little bit of fuzz, around the edge of the circle or so. But he never said that genes or atoms are impossible, objects. That he's going to be too, he's too relativist to allow anything like that to exist. And actually, I have in my book on Pearson, I have the picture of not just of an atom or of a gene, but what he calls the ether squirt. I'm trying to think what a squirt is. Probably a mysterious word, but like a jet d'eau on the jet d'éther or something, which he has about 3 lowers more primitive, more fundamental than a mere atom, and he illustrates it there's a picture of it right in his book. So if you can have ether squirts, you have no trouble with atoms or genes. And he simply says that a gene, like everything else, is a thing which is partly accurate and partly not, and is valuable to the extent it allows us to describe a behavior. And he could have and the objection we had to which we have heard, his objection to the to a kind of to the Mendelian explanation of human inheritance was that the number wasn't satisfactory, so it wasn't a good enough match. So that was an objection to a Mendelian explanation, but not that was and so he really did insist on quantitative fit, but he wasn't. He was happy to use tools like genetic units as well if they seemed to help him with this. I mean, there's a lot of. I mentioned this in my question. There's Fisher's paper that is the topic of this symposium. The 1918 paper actually makes a lot of effort, not just to get the categories right. So he was very insistent on using whatever genetic units as a part of the story. But he also was actually very interested in finding all the other background that would allow him to get a good match between the whatever we could say model or the theory and the observed results. And so, for instance, he asks about, after he's looked at the relationship between the parents and the offspring, then he asks, well, do we have good enough data to extend this to aunts and uncles and grandparents? So he's actually doing something that really is something quite a lot like the picture of ancestral inheritance. We can add to the story. We're interested in the correlation of the parents and their offspring, but can we build into the model or whatever? I don't think he's using this word model, but it's a very model-like system. Can we build into the model also what we know about the characteristics of more remote ancestors? Or either again, this will give us a better kind of inventory of the genetic material that is coming together in the parents, and would that allow us to predict more accurately than we had before the characteristics of the offspring. Now Fisher, who is even more aggressive than Pearson had been, I think, about how strongly the knowledge of the traits of the ancestors, that is to say the genetic material, would explain the characteristics of the offspring, that is, he believed that if we could gather enough information to know the full genetic, structure of the ancestry that has come into the offspring, we would have almost a complete explanation of many of the traits of interest. And this kind of thing, anyhow, is that is to say, trying to do genetics, let's say, or whatever, to study heredity, or trying to understand eugenics by constructing as much as we can of the ancestry is a very old story. It's not only that Francis Galton did it, which he did, but I just give you this some material I studied in my most recent book, which we have again, before anybody was using the word eugenics, nice German characters who have for a long time had been very concerned about human breeding, especially with the breeding of people showing showing defects like mental illness or insanity or lunacy. These are all words. They were beginning to fill up mental institutions, mental hospitals, from early in the 19th century. That gave rise to the first, again, without the name, the first kind of eugenics movement to try somehow to persuade families not to breed or not to marry, or maybe to isolate people in these institutions so as to block the reproduction of these terrible conditions, which from the 1820s and 1830s to about the 1870s was overwhelmingly insanity or mental illness. And then by the time of Galton's movement and Pearson's, what they called feeble-mindedness, that is the poor performance of children in schools, became a thing of similar importance. And there were, I have German asylum doctors and German psychologists trying to get full information about the genetic or the characters that could be inherited of these parents in order to try to anticipate how, to demonstrate that parents who had been committed to mental institutions were more likely to have children, and how much more likely they were to have children who would be, or actually they have to do it afterwards, who had also been committed to mental institutions. So this the effort to gather as much data as possible in order to predict the outcomes of offspring from those of the parents was a very old story. It's also the case that the attempt to reconcile or to understand how if the human inheritance is structured by genetic units, let's just say genes, a word which is gradually coming into use, or Germans have a nice word, Anlage, which lasts right through, starts before and they continue using it until the Second World War. If we know the hereditary units that have gone into the offspring, how do we? But if we know that kind of, how do we get continuous distributions rather than the kind of distributions that Mendel had? And the idea, again, actually, already in the early 1902, 3, and 4, Yule and 18 in the in the early 1900s, Yule and then Pearson are trying this out, and by the time Fisher wrote his paper in 1918, while the the arguments are not as complete, and the mathematics is certainly not as good. The idea that the way to interpret discontinuous characteristics like genes producing continuous distributions was simply above all a matter of combining two or more of them, rather than supposing that traits are all coded by a single one. So there was a widely shared sentiment. In the early 20th century, that this reconciliation, this explanation, was going against, and that is it's important to understand, as Jean Guéon emphasized, that around 1900. Pearson's group was almost the only movement that accepted Darwinian evolution by natural selection. So that is these scientists who believed in that statistics was the right basis for understanding evolution by natural selection. They were the ones who stuck with Darwinian explanation, and much of biology had turned strongly against Darwinian explanation. Bateson is the most, he just has amazing contempt for Darwin's weak thinking that would lead a person. The brave efforts of this poor person who would try to explain such implausible things in terms of mere continuous variation, rather than having a satisfactory explanation. So, the story, which is, I think, still often told as Darwin having provided an understanding or a model or a theory of evolution, which was lacking, crucially, a genetic mechanism, and that, the rediscovery of Mendelism gave us that genetic mechanism. I think it's. It certainly improved the explanation of evolution when Mendelian genetics was integrated into it. But the first reaction was of all the leading geneticists rejected. They rejected until for the first decade of the century. It's not true for the Fly Lab, the Columbia Morgan Fly Lab group, I think, but for the first decade, and for many scientists until after that, Mendelism was more like an alternative, a discontinuous mechanism that would provide an alternative to evolution by natural selection. So the argument between the biometricians and the Mendelians is also an argument about actually the acceptability of the Darwinian mechanism of natural selection. Now, Fisher clearly comes down on the pro-Darwinian side, but actually by the time he was working in the 19-teens, there were a number of biologists who were thinking, in broad terms, as I say, about combining Mendelism with continuous with an explanation of the transmission of continuous variation by supposing that for many traits, multiple genes, multiple genetic units are involved. So, and Fisher, well, I'm not going to say more about that. Fisher provides an interesting and a more structured, more better developed model of what that would be like, and how it can explain provide an explanation of inherited traits. Again, Fisher is extremely, as you all know, a very important figure in the history of evolutionary biology. Also, a just as active a eugenicist as Pearson and Galton, and just as committed to biological research for eugenic purposes as they were. yes, whoops, just one last thing, and then maybe I'll finish up. There we go. Oh, I see. Just do that. So I just wanted the last. Oh yeah, sorry. Just one last point is that in 1918, Fisher. I had forgotten, or I haven't studied Fisher as much as other people, but it was interesting to see. It's very important, very significant that he kind of gets rid of dominance, or at least he puts other possible relationships, or what happens when you have a heterozygote into the picture, and doesn't seem troubled at all by that. So it's so in a way he's he's less worried. I was talking about this blending idea. Certainly to get rid of dominance is to allow something more like blending within the mechanism, even for a single, even for a trait that's controlled by a single gene. So it's interesting that he's in a way he's less worried about that than many others were in his time. And then I just think it's interesting also that you may know in 1930 in the genetical theory of natural selection, Fisher actually gives a famous argument, which is repeated by biologists for decades afterwards, and maybe still, where he says that by about 1920, Pearson and Fisher just fall out totally. And so it's one of the bitterest, in a long line of bitter controversies in statistics. It's one of the great sites of, I say, second only to psychoanalysis, as a site of scientific contestation like this. And Fisher now used in 1930. Fisher says that before we had Mendel, we faced an understanding of blending inheritance. So he's actually, in some ways, Fisher is the guy I think who invented blending inheritance as a mechanism, and now he discovers blending inheritance. He attributes it to his enemy, Carl Pearson, and he says that no wonder there was so much skepticism about this mechanism, because with blending inheritance, almost all the variation disappears in every generation, and the only way to get it back would be a massive, massive mutation rate. So by 1930, Fisher has decided that sharp discontinuity in the inheritance, at least of single traits, is absolutely essential if anything we know about biology is going to work. And it's interesting, none of that shows up in 1920 or in 1918. I don't know. I'm not sure how interesting this is, but it certainly to me it seems quite curious that in a way Fisher's basic problematic for evolution by natural selection is a lot different in 1918 than it became in that book on the genetical theory, which I think is most fundamental for Fisher's importance as an evolutionary biologist. So thank you. With that, I'll finish, and thanks for having me here.